Welcome to this special edition of Diabetes Core Update, and we have titled this edition Mythbusters. That's fish oil, fact, fiction, and EPA. I'm your host, Dr. Neil Skolnik, professor of family and community medicine at the Sidney Kimmel Medical College of Thomas Jefferson University, and this special edition of Diabetes Core Update is sponsored by Amarin. Joining me for this podcast is Dr. John Osborne. Dr. Osborne is a preventive cardiologist and lipidologist who is Chief Medical Officer of Clear Cardio. Welcome, John.
Thanks so much for having me, Neil. It's a pleasure and an honor.
John, this is such a great topic. I think fish oil is one of those things that has captured the public's imagination since it first came out, and with that has raised lots of questions for clinicians over the years. Let's start with the basics, the relationship between eating more fish and perhaps the place of fish oil. It's been known for a long time. Can you discuss that evidence with us?
Sure. So there is certainly enough evidence behind enhancing your diet, supplementing, or rather replacing even better, other forms of protein, red meat in particular, and those kind of things, with instead high-quality fish, particularly the fatty fish that contains more of the quote-unquote fish oils. And so that quality of data is quite high, and because of that, the American Heart Association has certainly recommended now for a number of years, going back to at least 10 years, that to substitute into your diet at least a couple times a week a fatty type cold water fish like salmon, mackerel, anchovies, other smaller fish might fit the bill too, sardines, can allow you to integrate and obtain these beneficial omega-3 fatty acids by dietary changes. So that's certainly been in the guidelines for a number of years, and the evidence behind that is quite good. And I think that's certainly an easy to make recommendation across the board for everyone.
Yeah, and that evidence was based on large epidemiologic studies. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes. So again, we now have data. In fact, it's fascinating. If you go back to the 1970s, there was evidence from some Norwegian investigators who went to the Arctic areas and looked at what they were eating. Needless to say, they weren't eating a whole lot of green leafy vegetables up in the Arctic, but they were eating lots of fish and lots of mammals, to be honest, seals, that were eating lots and lots of fish. So they had a very high omega-3 fish oil or omega-3 fatty acid diet, which based on epidemiologic data suggested a lower risk of cardiovascular events, even though, again, they weren't eating a whole lot of green leafy vegetables up there for obvious reasons. So that's where all of this started. And I remember reading that as a medical student back in the 1980s and being really fascinated by this. And then now, 40, 50 years later, we now have an overwhelming data set and database, and now, of course, guidelines too, about what that should be and how we should fit that into both preventative strategies, such as eating more fish in our diet, but also even therapeutic strategies as well.
One of the interesting things is the inexact relationship between epidemiology and treatment. And we've seen this in many areas. This is one, so that eating more fish isn't the same as taking therapeutic doses of fish oil in addition to the red meat that you eat. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. And it's really fascinating. If you look at levels of EPA in particular, icosapent acid globally, and then divide it up into Western countries where we eat fish, but not a whole lot, versus other countries that eat a lot of fish, like Japan, the levels of EPA are different by fourfold. In fact, if you look at what they eat is with respect to EPA levels or icosapent omega-3 levels, right? So fish oil, which is really two flavors, EPA and DHA. That'll be important in a few minutes. If you look at omega-3 levels versus omega-6 are basically seed oils, right? And that's been a big topic recently as well amongst nutritionists and everybody else, that in the difference in Japan versus Western countries, US, of course, they consume about 20 times more omega-3s in their diet than we do in the US. We're mostly omega-6s. they mostly eat omega-3s because of the very high amount of fish intake in those countries. And therefore, their omega-3 levels, particularly EPA levels, are literally 4 times higher in Japan than they are in the U.S. And I will note, again, this is epidemiologic data. If you look at smoking and diabetes, smoking is higher in Japan than U.S. Diabetes rates, high blood pressure rates are about the same. And yet, the rates of cardiovascular events in Japan, again, multifactorial, appreciate that, are a third lower despite diabetes rates and hypertension rates being the same and lipid levels about the same as well, but that smoking levels are higher. Their rates of cardiovascular events as a population are about a third lower than U.S.
Fascinating, and that might relate to this intake of fish. Now, is there a proposed mechanism by which omega-3s might decrease cardiovascular disease?
Yeah, there's been a lot of work on this, particularly in the test tube level and in animal level, as far as looking at what is the secret sauce, right? How would omega-3s do this? So my PhD work was actually in something called icosanoids. So these are the breakdown products of omega-3s and omega-6s, actually, when they become agents in our body, such as thromboxane and prostaglandins that either have platelet aggregating effects, that is, they cause blood clots, or actually the opposite. So when you look at omega-3s, they actually produce agents in our body stimulated under stress that actually cause vasodilation. So they dilate the vessels, which is probably a good thing for high blood pressure, etc. And they also have antiplatelet effects. That is, they reduce the likelihood of clotting in the body as well. Unlike omega-6s or seed oils, would actually promote inflammation and promote vasoconstriction. That's one level. That was my PhD work at Jefferson, by the way. And then also we have lots of other data coming out of the Brigham and a guy named Preston Mason that has shown that these have anti-inflammatory effects, anticoagulant effects. They cause effects at the vascular level, at the blood vessel wall, to be less inflamed, less atherogenic. So we have a variety of mechanisms that might explain how they work on a mechanical level or experimental or scientific level. But most importantly, I always look at the outcomes trials, the cardiovascular outcomes trials, because that is the ultimate in human. Do they actually not just change a number or a profile or a coagulation status or a vasodilation status, but do they translate to less cardiovascular outcomes?
And that's critically important. And before we get to the clinical trial data, can you just help us understand, tease out omega-3s, you alluded to this earlier, are comprised of really 2 different types of oil, EPA and DHA. And can you tease that out for us a bit, the difference? Yeah.
So the way I like to explain it, so the fish oil that we either consume via eating our fatty fish, or the multi-billion-dollar fish oil supplement industry out there that supplies us with fish oil. We can talk about the quality of that and what we're actually getting. Basically, fish oil are what we call omega-3 fatty acids. There are 2 major flavors of that. One is EPA, icosapent acid, EPA. The other is docosahexaenoic acid, or DHA. So that is basically, when we talk about fish oil, there are other forms, they're much less common, etc. But those are the 2 major forms of that compromise what we call fish oil, EPA and DHA. The difference is just the length of the chains. One is 20, EPA is 20 carbon chains, 20 carbons in that molecule, and DHA is 22 carbons long. So those are the 2 important omega-3 fatty acids.
And that is critically important because the effects, of course, of EPA can be different than that of fish oil, which is a combination of EPA and DHA. John, can you take us through the evidence, starting with the evidence about fish oil and its effect on cardiac outcomes?
Yeah, so this is where it gets very interesting, and I think there's a lot of confusion, even at the lay level as well as many providers. So to summarize what has been over a 20-year experience in clinical trials involving tens of thousands of people in clinical trials, some of these were double-blinded randomized placebo-controlled trials, the most rigorous way of answering a scientific question, particularly in any space, but we have the luxury in the cardiovascular world to have a huge amount of trial experience. that when we look at what we call mixed omega-3 fatty acids, so that's a combination of EPA and DHA, and that's basically what you're getting with a dietary supplement fish oil, right? You're getting some combination of EPA and DHA. If you look at those trials that involve mixed omega-3 fatty acids at a whole variety of doses, from 1 gram a day, which is a fairly typical dose, up to 4 grams a day, so a more pharmacologic dose of those, mixed omega-3s that have both EPA and DHA have never been shown to lower cardiovascular events, which is important. Taking your dietary supplements, you are getting a mixed omega-3 preparation.
Yeah, I remember reading the strength trial when it came out, about 5 years ago. And that was a big trial, over 10,000 people. And if I recall, randomized to omega-3s versus, I think, corn oil, and no difference. That really clarified this area in a powerful way.
Yeah, it's interesting. So in the strength trial, they did use mixed omega-3 fatty acids. And again, the dose is important. Given 4 grams a day, which is a fairly stiff dose. And they looked over, the trial went out to about 4 years. It was over 10,000 patients. So very powerful, very large, strong, prospective, double-blinded, randomized, placebo-controlled trial. And if you look at cardiovascular events, which is the whole point of this trial, the curves, as we say, in those patients on placebo getting corn oil versus those getting 4 grams a day of a mixed omega-3 fatty acid were absolutely superimposable. There is absolutely no difference between those patients on placebo versus those getting 4 grams a day of a mixed omega-3 fatty acid. So very surprising scientifically, but also, too, that does reflect a number of other trials using mixed omega-3 fatty acids that yielded null results. There was no statistically significant benefit.
Fascinating. So that suggests that all the people who go to the big stores to buy those big jars of fish oil are likely not getting much benefit from that over-the-counter fish oil.
Yeah, we really have no evidence that mixed omega-3 fatty acids, either given as a pill, as a pharmacologic entity, or, of course, in the dietary supplement industry that provides those, we have no evidence that any of that lowers cardiovascular events.
Disappointing, but truth is often disappointing. Let's go on now to the evidence around Icosapent ethyl. So again, that portion of fish oil when given in its pure form. Lead us through that evidence.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. It actually goes back to the 1990s. So there was an early trial done called GELIS that was done in Japan. Now, I will say, parenthetically, if I were to do a fish oil study in any country, because what we already talked about, how much fish oil they obtain from dietary sources, Japan would be the last country I'd ever want to do that trial in, because the background rates of consumption of omega-3s are so very high. But they went ahead, they gave a dose of what would be biologically and pharmacologically Icosapent ethyl, which is basically EPA for our purposes, at 1.8 grams a day. And they showed about a 20% reduction in cardiovascular events rates, particularly in patients who had prior cardiovascular events. So that was one of the first trials ever to show that a pure EPA preparation may possess some important cardiovascular risk reduction aspects to it. Again, that trial was unclear. It was randomized, but it was open label as opposed to placebo controlled. It was done in Japan. So the questions of generalizability were always of concern with that trial. The other thing that also, as we became aware, as we studied the differences between EPA and DHA, that DHA tends to raise LDL cholesterol. That's the low-density cholesterol. That's kind of the bad cholesterol, the lethal life-threatening cholesterol, whereas EPA does not. So there began to accrue some additional data in the lipid or cholesterol space that differentiated these two products, DHA raising LDL, EPA not. So because of the interesting results from the GELIS trial, coupled with the understanding that biochemically and pharmacologically that EPA didn't raise LDL, whereas DHA did, we then started a trial back in about 2010 or so to look at a pure EPA preparation, Icosapent ethyl, also known as Vasipa is the brand name, to study that in patients who are at very high risk, either with diabetes and additional risk factors, or patients with established cardiovascular disease, that's balloon stents, bypass surgery, heart attack, strokes, or PAD, All of these patients were on appropriate pillars of therapy. So cholesterol-lowering drugs, statins, blood pressure drugs, if you had diabetes, taking diabetes drugs, antiplatelet drugs such as aspirin, etc. So on top of all those proven pillars of prevention in the cardiovascular world, we then randomize those individuals either to 4 grams a day of pure EPA, icosapent ethyl, or to placebo, and then follow them out over about 4.9 years. And this trial, by the way, published in January of 2019, was called the Reduce It trial, published in the New England Journal of Medicine.
Critically important trial, and it showed.
So here were the results, just like the JALIS trial, but this one, double-blinded, randomized, placebo-controlled trial, more rigorously done scientifically, showed if you look at major adverse coronary events, we lowered those. This is unstable angina, this is balloon stents, bypass surgery, fatal cardiovascular events, non-fatal heart attacks, non-fatal strokes. So those 5 major adverse cardiac events were collectively reduced by another 25%.
And that's impressive because that issue of residual risk, and we've talked about that at times on this podcast, the issue of residual risk is a big deal. And just for our listeners, that's the risk, the cardiovascular risk that remains after someone is appropriately treated for their hypertension, smoke ending, their diabetes reaching goal, and good cholesterol management. You're still left with significant cardiovascular risk, defined as residual risk. And in this trial, as you said, people were well treated, and this was a 25% improvement on top of good treatment, so addressing residual risk.
Absolutely. And I think it's also interesting, they did study a patient population that had proven from prior studies very high residual risk, even though they're taking their aspirin, their blood pressure's controlled, their diabetes controlled, they're on cholesterol drugs and statins and other drugs. At this population, even though the LDL was very well controlled, in the trial, the baseline LDL levels were about 74, 76 milligrams per deciliter, so very well controlled. And they also had modestly elevated triglycerides. So this was defined in the trial as anywhere between 135 milligrams per deciliter up to 499. So this type of modestly elevated triglyceride level is seen extremely commonly. This is literally represents millions of people in the U.S. that fit this profile, who have established cardiovascular disease or diabetes on statin therapy, but still have significant residual risk. And this was targeted to that higher risk population and showed another 25% reduction in major adverse cardiac events. And interestingly, when you delve into the data, we found that although they had to have modestly elevated triglyceride levels to get into the trial, it was not the reduction in triglycerides that lowered their risk. Because, by the way, for those of you out there, you may note that these drugs have been used to lower triglycerides for a very long period of time. And they certainly do lower triglycerides. But as it turns out, to lower cardiovascular risk, it was not the lowering of triglycerides that caused the benefit. It was something different.
Fascinating. And that has something to do with all those effects that you talked about earlier, the anti-inflammatory effects and the vascular effects. So that's really the evidence base that led to a change in guidelines, right?
Exactly. And it's remarkable, since the publication of this study early in 2019, literally every organization in the U.S. that issues guidelines in this space, from the ADA, the American Diabetes Association, the American Heart Association, the American College of Cardiology, the National Lipid Association, even the kidney doctors, the KDIGO docs, and others involved in the cardiometabolic space have recognized this data and endorsed this strategy. And not just in the U.S., but literally worldwide. U.S., Canada, South America, Middle East, Asia, Europe, Australia. So wow. It really has taken the preventative cardiology space by storm, because very profound, important data that allows us to further lower that residual risk that you were talking about, Neil.
So if in just a sentence or two for our listeners, what do the guidelines say? What is the action statement from those guidelines?
So it very much is designed, and the guidelines are designed and really reflect the population that was studied in the REDUCE-IT trial. So we had patients with diabetes, even if they did not have known cardiovascular disease, that's balloon stents, bypass surgery, heart attack, strokes, or patients with established cardiovascular disease, again, balloon stents, bypass surgery, heart attack, strokes. In that population, on statin therapy, controlled LDLs, who want to make sure that's attended to, if they had modestly elevated triglycerides between 135 to 499, in that population, which is a very simple but very large, broad population in the U.S., there is substantial proven benefit of the use of adding on Icosapent ethyl 4 grams a day to their strategy to further lower the risk of cardiovascular events.
John, it's so helpful to have gone over all of the evidence from just the early history of fish oil through the different trials and really putting it together with now what the guidelines say. We're about out of time. Last thoughts for our listeners.
So it's been a fascinating journey. I've had the luxury of being able to explore this and personally, since the 80s, being at Jefferson in medical school up until now, almost 30 years into my preventative cardiology practice, it's been fascinating to watch the evolution of omega-3s, see what works, what didn't work, what didn't pan out, and to be able to now, with this data from the REDUCE-IT trial and other trials too, to be able to say that, yes, there are other things that we can do and offer to you, adding multiple levels of protection to be able to ultimately, what I like to say, my goal as a preventative cardiologist, Neil, is I want you guys in primary care to put me and my other cardiology colleagues out of business. So I think we're getting closer and closer to that day every day. And when heart disease ceases to be an issue, I will be very happy. And I will know to thank you, Neil, and about 350 million other people out there.
I hope that all comes true. Dr. John Osborne, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you again, Neil. It's a real pleasure.
And to our listeners, as always, thank you for joining us on this Mythbusters Fish Oil versus Icosapent Ethyl, sponsored by Amarin. For the American Diabetes Association, I'm Dr. Neil Skolnik. Till next time, stay safe and keep learning.